Hey everybody, my name is Joe Kita. I'm the editor of the Fresno Bee, and I wanted to invite you today to our live event. This is an event out of the Fresnoland Lab at the Bee, and we're going to be talking today about what to do if you are facing an eviction or if you are potentially having a problem with a landlord. I know there's a lot of confusion out there right now about just what has happened, if evictions have been stopped, if they haven't. And we're going to try to get to the bottom of these issues today. So in a minute here, I'm going to introduce to you Donnie Bergstrom. She is the policy and engagement editor of the Fresnoland Lab, and she's going to be our moderator. What I'm going to be doing is monitoring all of the comments that show up on Facebook and then inserting those into the conversation at some point so that our esteemed panelists here today can answer them. So Donnie,
hello, everyone.
Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our Facebook Live session today for renters that are trying to navigate what they should do in these very challenging times if you're not able to pay your rent and you're potentially facing some ramifications from your landlord. Today, we have 4 very esteemed guests joining us to answer all of your questions. We have Patience Milrod, who is the Executive Director of Central California Legal Services. We have Nikki Love, her colleague, who is the manager at CCLS. We have Janine Nkosi, who is a professor of sociology at Fresno State and the regional advisor for Faith in the Valley. And we have Amber Crowell, who is also a professor of sociology at Fresno State and also a regional advisor at Faith in the Valley. So today what we're going to do, how our format is going to work is I'm going to walk through some of the common questions that we have heard and our panelists have heard through a lot of their experiences dealing with renters who are struggling to pay rent right now. And we'll walk first through some of those questions. If you have a question yourself, feel free to type it in the box and we can bring it up and make sure that that question gets answered. We want to try to get to as many questions that you all have in the audience as possible. So with that, I'm going to start with a really basic question, which is a very important one. Do I still have to pay my rent? Nikki, you want to kick us off?
Okay, yes, definitely. With regards to the state of emergency that is going on right now, there are protections in place, but what everybody needs to know is that there's still a requirement to pay rent. There may be protections for you depending on where you live, but paying rent is something that is necessary if you have the ability.
Thank you. And how do you, if you're not able to pay all of your rent or some of your rent, how do you tell your landlord, how do you start to begin those conversations with your landlord about what your situation is?
I guess I'll go again.
Yeah.
You want to have that conversation with your landlord. There are emergency orders and ordinances that have been put into place in different regions. But the first thing you want to do is let your landlord know that you have had a COVID-19 situation that is making it difficult for you to pay rent. You should definitely contact, I will say us, Central California Legal Services, for guidance on what you need to let your landlord know and how you're going to handle it. But one of the things that I would say is letting your landlord know that you've had a COVID-19 related issue, documenting it, and making sure that you have the documentation to back it up is what's very important right now.
What kinds of documentation are the most important? I know in Fresno, the city of Fresno has an emergency order where they provided some suggestions. I know the governor also has his executive order where they've provided another set of potential documents that people should be sending to their landlord. What would you recommend, both for renters in the city of Fresno, but if you don't live in the city of Fresno, what's an ideal form of documentation if you're not able to pay your rent to show that you have experienced a loss of income?
I think that this situation there needs to be some flexibility. When it comes to informing your landlord that you are unable to pay your rent, it is any documentation that can prove it. There have been statements and write-ups that explain, various things that are available. But if you don't have those things, you should get something. It could be a statement from your employer. It can be, some people have said stuff about like bank statements and things like that. But really what you want to do is you want to show something that proves that you've got a COVID-19 situation. And flexibility, I think, is what's most important here, because when you give a list, it naturally takes things off of it. And every discussion, everything that's been put out has explained that there is flexibility in what should be provided. So if you have something from your employer that says that your hours have been reduced, or that you've been laid off, or that you've signed up for unemployment, you want to provide those types of things. Of course, keeping protected your personal information, that some of these things should not be provided to a landlord.
What happens if a person was laid off or lost their hours before the emergency orders went into effect and before we went into shelter in place? What kinds of, should you still notify your landlord? And if so, what does that look like?
Well, the hope is that landlords will work with their tenants. We're in a state of emergency right now. And what that means, and what every government official has said, is that we need to keep people in their homes during this state of emergency. So definitely you want to talk to your landlords, and you want to provide them insight onto what's going on with you.
Janine, I know you have worked with a lot of renters and tenants across the valley facing a lot of these situations. What advice are you giving folks you're working with? What are you hearing? What's useful right now?
Well, definitely we are looking to the legal aid partners that we have here in this space. They're the experts that guide us in providing information that we then pass along to tenants. So when tenants notify their landlord, to get it in writing by email, by text, and to hold on to that information just in case you should need it in court later on. But one thing I just wanted to mention also is that on Saturday, the Fresno eviction protection order is set to expire. And so we are strongly encouraging the city council to extend that. But in addition to extending it, one of the things that they can do to strengthen the current ordinance is to remove the need to provide that documentation to landlords altogether. Other jurisdictions have removed that as a barrier to tenants needing, putting that burden on tenants, especially when we think about people who are undocumented, or people who are undocumented. These create barriers for them to be able to get notification and then send, that to their landlords.
Thanks, Janine. That's helpful. So moving on from this question of documentation, I would love to hear a little bit more about what happens next in the process. So let's say I can't pay all of my rent, or I can't pay any of my rent. I've submitted some documentation to my landlord, kind of explaining what's going on. What happens after that? Patience, do you want to take a stab at that part in the process?
Sure. So first of all, I do want to emphasize you should pay your rent if you can. And that makes it way easier down the road if there is a court case. Ultimately, depending on where you're located, you may have to pay your rent immediately. All the past due rent, you may be on the hook for it right away, or you may have a period of time to pay it back. So if you can work with your landlord, that's much better than not. In terms of what happens after you give your landlord notice, if you do that, and I agree with Janine, it's a burden on tenants, and it's a hoop that some people may know to jump. They may find out about it in time so that they can do something about it, or they may not. But they're still out of work and not paying their rent because they cannot work because of COVID-19. But once you've given your landlord some notice, then the landlord will do one of two things. The landlord can still give you a notice to pay rent or quit. What the landlord cannot do is go to court and file a lawsuit to evict you. So the courts are closed. Once the courts open again, the landlord may be able, if depending on, like, this is why you should, if you're not sure, call legal aid, 800-675-8001. I'm going to keep saying that over and over again because, and Nikki will say it over and over again, because your specific location and your specific facts of what's happening with you will make a difference in terms of what happens ultimately. And it's a pretty complicated scene right now. So it's much better to get advice. And there's there on our website, which is centralcallegal.org. You can find information. You can find some basic information. Included there is a link to a fabulous compendium in English and Spanish that Faith in the Valley put together of resources for tenants, information and forms and whatnot. So strongly recommend that you get information that applies to your specific situation. So long answer to a short question.
Yeah, thank you, Patience. So along those lines, you said that a landlord they can give you a notice to pay or quit. Can you just clarify, that is not an eviction, right? Just to make sure our audience understands that. Okay.
So appreciate that. So
yeah.
you have a deal with your landlord. You're going to pay your rent. The landlord is going to let you live in this place, and the place is supposed to be in certain kinds of conditions and whatnot. So it's a contract between you and the landlord. If you're not paying your rent, then the landlord, again, this is just between you and the landlord can give you a notice saying, hey, you're not holding up your part of the deal, you have to leave. So, but the landlord can't make you leave, meaning the landlord cannot shut off your utilities, cannot remove your front door, cannot do self-help to get you out of there. The landlord has got to go to court and get a judge to order you to leave. So that pay rent or quit notice, that's just a private communication from the landlord to you. That is not a court order. And it does not mean you have to leave. And it means right now, it does not mean you have to leave until at least the end of the moratorium, which the statewide, the Judicial Council order, it extends until the end of the governor's order. So the executive order, which right now is indefinite. I don't think it has an end. So, so it's absolutely the case that the landlord doesn't get to have you leave just because they want you to leave. The landlord has got to get a court order in order to make you leave. That answers
That's helpful. Oh, sorry, Janine, did you want to jump in on that?
Oh, what I just wanted to say is that right now we're talking about folks still needing to pay their rent, and that's absolutely the case. But the sad reality is that a lot of people have been laid off from work. They're not working. Businesses have closed. People's hours have been reduced. And so, I mean, we definitely need for tenants to know what they need to do right now. And one of the things that we really want folks to work with us at Faith in the Valley to organize together to get the governor to put in place an emergency rent program, a rent forgiveness. So that way the landlords are still able to make their payments and tenants are not going to be served with those 3-day eviction notices. And that can be done at the statewide level, but also at the local level. We are really strongly urging the Board of Supervisors for Fresno County, as well as the city of Fresno, to put in place an emergency rent program. Los Angeles, the Board of Supervisors in Los Angeles, they just passed an emergency rent fund specifically to help vulnerable tenants who cannot pay their rent due to COVID. And the city of Fresno, they used some of the stimulus money from the CARES Act. And the city of Fresno is set to receive $4.4 million in CDBG dollars from the federal stimulus as well. And so we really strongly encourage our local leaders to put that in place, because then people can pay their rent. And the reality is that they're not working. Folks are not working right now, or they're working limited hours and they can't make rent. And that's one way that we can address that.
Thanks, Janine. I appreciate that. So going to some of the questions that we have, I know that I saw a report in the Los Angeles Times where landlords were asking tenants to essentially pledge their stimulus check or unemployment benefits towards their rent. Can they do that? Is that allowed?
I'll get started on that. That money, the stimulus check and the unemployment, is put into place for people to be able to function, feed their families, to be able to also get to do everything that they need to do. They are not required to pledge their full amount of their stimulus checks or their unemployment. This is something that needs to be worked out between the landlord and the tenant, but is not something that is envisioned that that whole money would just be handed over to the landlord.
What about a security deposit? Is that something that a landlord can use if you're not able to pay rent? Can they use that to cover an April payment or a May payment?
It's probably better than giving a pay rent or quit notice. I just want to point out, that landlords they own the property. Sometimes they're paying a mortgage. Sometimes they're not paying a mortgage, but sometimes they are. Foreclosures are also halted right now. So there is an effort to try to limit the impacts upstream as well as the impacts on the tenant. The other thing I totally agree with Janine, it would make really a great deal of good sense for there to be a local, actually funds from whatever source to help tenants pay rent. But it's whether or not that happens, tenants eventually there's going to be a reckoning. And so as the folks who are going to be meeting them at the end of the emergency, when they've got a huge debt piled up, that, that's going to be a point when there are going to be either mass evictions or there's going to be some next public step, which I don't know what that might be. So we're looking downward several months, and it's so important. Nikki's 1,000% correct. You have to feed your kids. You have to make sure there's people have shoes. You have to take care of the necessities. And if you can pay some rent, then that's an investment in reducing your stress in future.
And I think something also, just in terms of the stimulus money that folks are receiving, prior to the COVID pandemic, this public health crisis that we're experiencing, people were already barely making ends meet, and some of them were not able to do it. We say that so many people are only one unexpected life event from falling short on their rent and being vulnerable to eviction. And the reality is that everybody is currently experiencing an unexpected life event. And the reality also is that so many people are already rent burdened. So the biggest expenditure is rent. It's paid first, and there's not a lot of money that's left over. And so really putting in place an emergency rent program to help folks pay that biggest expenditure is really important. And I think, Amber, if you want to chime in, anything related to the rent burden, this is an area that I know you have a lot of expertise in.
Yeah, I can speak on the rent burden first, which is that, the conversations about affordable housing in California often focus on the Bay Area and LA, but actually we have, over half the households, renter households in the Central Valley are rent burden, which means too much of their money is just going to paying rent, which means, as Janine said, one thing goes wrong and suddenly you can't pay for your housing. So what that means is that we're in the middle of this global crisis. We're expecting a lot of people to fall behind in their rent. So down the road, Patience, said it really well. She said there's a reckoning coming, which means when all of these protections are lifted, because they will not last forever, what we're going to find is that a lot of people are going to be receiving those eviction notices. The people who don't have a good relationship with their landlord, or one that's, more mutually helpful. And what we've seen before all of this is that most tenants do not have legal representation, meaning that they're going to go to court not knowing how this process works, not knowing how to respond to the eviction complaint. And that was a problem before this crisis. We expect it to be much bigger after this is over if we do not educate people right now on what's going on, and also direct people to legal aid so that they know what to prepare for, which is why we started with talking about documentation, because that's part of that process later. The burden is on the tenants when this is all over to defend their case. So we need to really emphasize to tenants that you need to have your documentation. You need to be ready down the road when all this is over to deal with that eviction notice if it comes.
Thanks, Amber. That's helpful. So we have a few reader questions. Do you want to throw one up on the screen so we can get it answered?
Absolutely. We've got a few here. Some of them are statements, but there are a few questions, and some of them are also on the landlord side as well. And maybe this is one that I don't know if we're equipped to answer. Does Fresno plan on implementing a rent program similar to Los Angeles? Anyone have any inside information on that?
All I can say is if this question is aimed at the Los Angeles Board of Supervisors in terms of what they just passed, that emergency rent fund, I don't have any inside scoop, but what I do know is that we are organizing with renters across the county of Fresno and homeowners to urge the city of Fresno to put a similar program in place, and there's funding. There's funding to do that, and we want to work with the city of Fresno to make that happen.
Yeah, I'm working on a story. Hopefully, we'll get published later this week on this, and I can say that what I've heard so far from city officials is they don't have a definitive plan yet in place for the stimulus money that could potentially be used for that purpose. But more to come.
Yeah, and one other thing I think about that is, in theory, prior to the pandemic, in theory, we had rental assistance. Maybe you can call 211, or you could maybe go through the Salvation Army and you can try to get some assistance if you fell short on your rent, had an emergency situation. But the reality is, when we called around to try to find out where folks could go to get some assistance, the very few places that actually existed were having at that point to already turn away 50 people or more who were calling in every single week trying to get rent assistance. So yeah, we really need an emergency rent program that is implemented through the city of Fresno or the county board of supervisors.
Okay, here's another question.
What about homeless people who lived in hotels but now lost their job? Nikki, would you like to take that one first?
That is a very specific question. And what I would say is, if somebody is in that situation, they should call Central California Legal Services. The phone number that was mentioned earlier, 1-800-675-8001. The reason why I say that is because hotels are in a slightly different situation, and it is specific to the city in which they're in and how long they've lived there and what is going on. So I think that's the best I can do with that question is call us to get further information on that.
Can you say the number one more time for that?
1-800, the phone number is 1-800-675-8001.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got one more right now if you want me to put it out here. Let me find it here. This is more from a landlord.
Okay, great. This question is from Elsa Leon, and she says, I'm a landlord and I depend on the rent to pay my bills. If I don't get the rent, how am I going to pay the bills? Who's going to help us landlords? I know there's quite a few, or not quite a few, there's a few programs in place to help on the landlord side. Who wants to pick that question up first?
Janine, did you have some resources for homeowners and landlords?
Yeah, the consumer finance website, I'm not sure if we are able maybe to put that on the Facebook page, but the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau has a toolkit that they've made available that outlines the different like forbearance programs that have been put in place and how homeowners can go about trying to get a forbearance. Some mortgage holders are doing like 6 months or, are putting the payments at the end of the term of the loan, so that creates a lot of cushion for landlords without penalty. So your credit or other things are not going to be penalized as a result of what the governor was able to put in place, and that I think is a very helpful resource because it's got like a frequently asked questions and information for how folks can go about getting help. There's all. Go ahead, Patience. I'm sorry.
I was just saying, good.
Yeah, and even another resource for small business owners. If folks go to smallbusinessassociation.gov, there's some funding that has been set aside to specifically help small business owners, and I believe the state of California has a certain unemployment benefit specifically for small business owners, independent contractors, and folks who wouldn't normally qualify for the traditional unemployment benefits if you say you've lost your job. So those, I think, are two other good resources for folks.
And one more thing I'll just add is I know that the new payroll protection program, which was part of the CARES stimulus package, which reimburses some small businesses for payroll-related expenses, they're working on some guidance on how that applies to landlords and property management companies. So I'll be watching that and hopefully reporting on that as it comes out, but I would just also pay attention to that program as a potential resource as well. Okay, so let's go back to some of our other questions we have. Let's talk about repayment agreements. I know that many renters are probably, after they've given some documentation to their landlord about what they should do if they can't pay rent, may be looking at what it looks like to pay back the rent that's due. Nikki, do you want to take a stab on what it looks like to create that agreement and what happens if you do not sign a repayment agreement?
For a repayment agreement, you want to be realistic. You should be paying as much rent as you can, but also be understanding that a repayment agreement that says you will pay more than what you even know you have at this point in time is something that's difficult. You're signing something that is quite honestly extra to what your lease is. So you want to realistically look at your finances and figure out how much you're able to pay. An agreement with your landlord can be done in any way, but you should first be thinking about what is it you have, how much are you able to pay, and talk to your landlord about what is available to make these payments. You want to, before you enter an agreement, contact CCLS, because depending on where you are, it may affect how much you have to pay your landlord back. There are different locations in which there are no late fees that are allowed to be put onto your missed rent. So you need to know where you stand, and definitely contacting CCLS is one of the ways you can do that. Also, there are materials available on the CCLS website, along with materials that Faith in the Valley has been getting out about what it looks like on how much you owe for your rent.
Thanks, Nikki. That's helpful. One thing I forgot to add in our conversation for landlords, just want to make sure that if you are a landlord, that you are reaching out to the California Apartment Association. They are producing a lot of webinars and different resources for both larger landlords and smaller mom and pop landlords to help them navigate both how they can deal with some of the eviction protection orders that are in place, what they can and can't do with their tenants, and what resources are available to avoid foreclosure if they're not getting rent payments. So just check out California Apartment Association if you haven't done that already. Okay, back to the questions. Let's talk a little bit about evictions that may have been in process before the COVID-19 crisis hit. What could happen if you already have an unlawful detainer claim filed against you? Are you still potentially able to get evicted over the next few months, or could you experience a sheriff's lockout if your unlawful detainer claim was filed prior to this crisis?
In Fresno County, Sheriff Mims has announced that the Sheriff's Department is not going to do any more lockouts while there is a shelter-in-place order. So we'll see. We want to hear if people are being noticed that there's going to be a lockout. CCLS wants to know because we want to get in the way of that if we possibly can. The whole point of the shelter-in-place order is that people need to not be moving around. They need to not be taking the bus to go and try and find another place to live or moving right now, because people need to be isolated from each other. So the public health purpose is defeated if the sheriff is doing lockouts, and it's our understanding that at least in Fresno County, that's not going to be happening. But if you've got a lockout notice, we want to know. So CCLS 800-675-8001. Thank you, Carla, for posting our phone number in the chat comments, in the comments list. So yeah, there should not be any action if the landlord has filed an unlawful detainer and there's no judgment yet. The courts should not be acting on it until the governor or until the judicial council says it's okay. And that won't be for, I can't remember if it's 60 or 90 days after the our governor's emergency order comes to an end. So there's a significant period of time where, you know, you'll have a chance to pull it back together before the impact of the lawsuit hits. And you need, of course, to answer the lawsuit if you haven't answered it. So, but your need to answer is also your time is extended. Usually you only have 5 days. Well, now your time is extended until after the emergency order comes to an end.
Got it. Do tenants right now have protection from no-cause evictions? And Patience or Nikki, as you're answering that question, could you also just explain for people who maybe don't know what a no-cause eviction is, what that is?
Nikki, I'm deferring to you on this.
Okay. In the Central Valley, a no-cause eviction is a situation in which the landlord just decides that they no longer want the tenant living there. And so I'll jump to the question, and definitely if people need more explanation, I'd be glad to give it. But for protections for no-cause evictions, right now what the courts are doing, again, we're in a state of emergency, is trying to keep people in place. And what that is to put a pause on a lot of evictions. One of the things, though, it doesn't stop is the evictions that are harming, or the removal of people from homes that are harming other people. So I guess one way to say it is if you were doing something illegal, domestic violence, things like that, you can still be removed from your home. But a no-cause eviction would just be a landlord who says, you know what, I no longer want you living here, and I would like you to leave. At this point in time, the courts have gone with what the governor has said and what's said in various jurisdictions about the fact of needing to pause these types of things. So yes, right now it is paused. But once the emergency orders are released, once the stay-at-home orders are released, things will start progressing forward. And there's still leeway in between the time of the end of the stay-at-home orders, the state of emergency, to when things will start up again.
Okay, thank you, Nikki. That's helpful. A question that I saw on our list: do you have to let maintenance workers into your unit at this time? These are strange times and we're trying to social distance as much as possible. what sort of interaction with people who might be performing repairs or inspections is expected and reasonable at this point in time?
So the maintenance people should not be coming in to change a light bulb or replace a battery in the smoke alarm. Although, I mean, you need a smoke alarm. But the landlord has to, if there's some kind of thing going on in your unit where the place is falling to pieces, if the plumbing is leaking and it's creating a serious situation that shouldn't go on because it's a threat to health and safety and it's a threat to the premises, well, then you probably want to work with your landlord because you don't want to live with that either. So you want to work with your landlord to allow the maintenance person in. But there shouldn't be any kind of just regular non-emergency maintenance going on right now, unless you're asking to have it done because it's urgent, because you don't want the maintenance people to be exposed either, unless there's a really good reason. So again, there's public health reasons for sheltering in place and isolating ourselves from each other, which is why we're doing this thing on whatever this platform is, by video, right? Instead of in a public meeting place. So we need to honor that, and landlords need to also honor that.
Great, thank you. Joe, you have a question from our audience right now?
Yeah, so patients, along those lines, Jeanette Jackson here has asked a question, and apparently she's spending about $600 a month because she has a water leak at her unit. And she's been covering that and waiting for the repair. The repair isn't happening. How long does she have to continue to pay that water bill because of the leak?
Okay, well, we can't give legal advice on the air, right? And there are mechanisms for getting the leak repaired, and you have to do it exactly correctly, but deducting from your rent and whatnot, you have to give notice to the landlord. It's all very complicated. Don't try this at home, boys and girls, but if that's exactly the kind of thing where you should call Central California Legal Services at 800-675-8001. And we can give you information about how to go about doing repair and deduct so that you don't have, that's crazy, $600 a month. That's just, you've been very patient. So yeah, I would call us.
I have a question for Patience and Nikki, and also maybe for you, Amber and Janine, to follow up if needed, on late fees and penalties if people do not pay their rent or if they only pay some of the rent. Are landlords allowed to charge late fees or any penalties at this time? And if so, what does that process look like?
That, I would say, depends on where you live. The reality is there are certain locations like Fresno City, which have put things into place which ask that landlords, and this requirement, that they do not charge a late fee for somebody who has a COVID-19 related issue with not being able to pay their rent or their full amount of rent. But again, it's based on the location. And so again, I know we've been saying this number many times, but you should call us and find out whether or not your location is one of the ones that the city or county has put in an ordinance that stops late fees and interest and things like that.
I have another question that is about domestic violence situations. We've seen in a lot of local news reports in the Bee that domestic violence and child abuse are on the rise right now as people are sheltering in place. If someone is in a situation where they are trying to avoid a person that is abusing them, what does the eviction process look like in those types of situations?
That's very it is actually a domestic violence situation that is happening, you definitely should be calling for assistance. There are, I very passionate about this. So at Central California Legal Services, we provide services along those lines. You would call us up. There are other organizations as well that have hotlines that you can call up if you are in a domestic violence situation, or if you have, you know, a family member who is. Those things have not shut down. The ability to have yourself or have that person removed from the home has not shut down. The purpose of these stay-at-home orders and a state of emergency is for your health and well-being. It is not for you to continue to go through an abusive situation. So call us, Central California Legal Services. We put the phone number there. There's hotlines that are available. One of the things that we are doing this for is to let people know that even though a lot of people are not inside of their buildings, we're still answering phones. We are still meeting with people virtually. We're doing what we can to ensure that you get the resources that you need. And the thing that I can say most of all is call and get assistance. What that means, it is a domestic violence situation, and it's not a straight eviction one. And more explanation would be needed, quite honestly, from a domestic violence expert on that one.
Great. I think I have wrapped up the questions that I have. I'm going to turn to our audience for a moment and see if anyone wants to type in a few more questions while I turn to our panelists and ask you all, what haven't we covered? What's really important words of wisdom that tenants, but then also homeowners should be taking in at this point for how they're going to pay their rent or mortgage payment?
One thing that I want to add, I'm sorry if you hear children in the background while I'm talking, is that you shouldn't assume that, this is to renters, you shouldn't assume that your landlord knows the current policies. So that question about late fees, if you do get hit with late fees and penalties, your landlord may not know that they live in an area where they're not supposed to do that. So it's really, really important to always check with legal aid to make sure that your rights under the current emergency policies aren't being violated. Because again, what we were seeing in eviction court before this crisis is that tenants had very little room to speak and defend themselves in the courtroom because they often don't have legal representation. Landlords usually are represented by lawyers. So it's really important that you always check with legal aid and make sure that your rights aren't being violated as a renter.
Great. Thank you, Amber. That's helpful. Janine, Patience, Nikki, any other last bits of wisdom or not legal advice, because we're on Facebook Live, but maybe perhaps more informal advice for both renters and homeowners that are not sure if they'll be able to pay rent in the coming months?
I think for me, I'll go in here because I think that the legal aid, the legal experts, we want for them to have the last words. I just really want folks to know they're not alone. That so many renters throughout the county of Fresno and in the city of Fresno are impacted. And so I really want to encourage folks to go to Faith in the Valley's Facebook page. Like that page, you can send a little comment to us through Messenger with just your contact information so that we can reach out to you. We also have organizers that work in San Joaquin County, Stanislaus, Merced, and Kern County as well. And so I just don't want folks to be struggling alone when so many of us are being impacted. And it's really going to take all of us, renters and homeowners and everyone, coming together and asking our local leaders as well as our state leaders to do the right thing. People should not be having to worry or choose between food and rent or medicine and rent or being worried about being out on the streets. And they shouldn't have to worry about a legal defense, later on. We can work together. We've been doing it. These protections that have been being passed, they are passed because renters and homeowners were all coming together and we're asking our local leaders to put these protections in place. And we're thankful that they are hearing our call. They're putting some things in place, but there's more that we can do. And I want us to just do it together.
Thanks, Janine. Patience.
I've got a question too.
Oh, sure.
If you want me to jump in with one here. This one is from Lourdes Oliva. And I think what she's saying here is that if she rents a room in a home, can she be kicked out because it's not a formal apartment?
Hi, Lulu. If there is a tenancy, if the person who owns the home is collecting money, then it's a tenancy. And so that means, just like any other tenancy, it has to be brought to an end by a court order. Now, if there's violence, or there's somebody's cooking meth in the bathroom, or if there's a good reason for someone to leave, that's a different thing. But if it's a straight up tenancy situation, then no. I mean, for the same reason that people can't be kicked out of their apartments, someone who's renting a room likewise has protections, and that's what you're paying your rent for. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for hosting this. We are at Central California Legal Services. One of the things we are really interested in doing is making sure that people understand what their rights are, because Janine is 1,000% correct, and Amber's 1,000% correct. If you don't know what it is your rights are, you don't know that you have a right to resist. So that's why half the people that leave their homes involuntarily, they don't go out by court order. They go out because the landlord gives them a paper that says, I want you to leave. And they go, oh, okay, don't do that. You don't need to do that, especially now where you could endanger yourselves and your families. Don't do that. There needs to be a court order before you get out of there. The other thing that I'm beginning to hear is happening is that landlords are just fed up and they don't want to go to court. They can't go to court because the courts are closed, and the Judicial Council has said no evictions for months, and they're like, well, I want this person out of here. I'm going to shut their water off, or I'm going to shut their heat, their access to utilities, or take off their front door, or whatever. That situation, lawyers can help with that. That's why God made lawyers. We want to get involved. So we want to hear from you. If your landlord is trying to evict you without going to court and going through the proper channels and doing the right thing, then I don't care how much rent you owe. We want to know about that. The landlord can face fines and fees and penalties and all kinds of things themselves if they break the law, because that's breaking the law. So our website is centralcallegal.org. Our phone number is 800-675-8001. And we want to hear from you because we want to help.
Thank
So
you,
Patience, I've got a quick question, and I'm sure it might be on the minds of some of our audience today. How much does it cost to use CCLS? Is this something that's free? And how do they best get in touch with you, either over that phone, or is there some other way?
Thank you so much. We serve people, low-income people. We do not charge them. Our services are 100% free. You can reach us by calling us at 800-675-8001 or on our website. Although you need to call us if you've got a specific problem and you want us to help you. The only way to do that is to phone us and we have a legal advice line, and so you may get advice, or if that's all you need, or you may get referred to other resources. If you have more than one issue, if you're facing an eviction and you're a domestic violence victim, or you've lost your public benefits, there are a number of ways that we help folks. So if you've got an issue, we'd love to hear from you, and we'd like to help. Thanks, Joe. Important point.
Thank you, Patience. I have just one more question. That forgot to come up in the previous discussion. Patience or Nikki, maybe you can answer this. If you are a person, if I have a Section 8 voucher that I use as part of my rent, and I've lost my income, and so I can't pay the rest of my rent, am I able to get evicted if I have a Section 8 voucher?
Nikki?
If you have a Section 8 voucher, the first thing you should do is contact your worker and let them know what happened with your income. I would say that should be your first thing. Definitely call CCLS, but contact your Section 8 worker. Let them know. They are going to want to know how much income you are having. So if you don't have any income, you need to let them know. So there may be a mechanism in place to lower the amount of rent that your portion has to pay. Beyond that, I would say that, well, really, that's the first thing, and that chances are will fix a lot of what your situation is.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes, Janine has a comment that she wants to add on just why it's so important for people to understand their rights and avoid eviction. Janine, do you want to just jump in on that really fast?
Sure. I noticed that Jeanette Jackson had commented about the severity. If someone does get an eviction on their record, we've worked with tenants who have described that as being like a 7-year sentence, because the barriers that are put in place for tenants to try to get into housing, stable housing later after they have an eviction is just tremendous. Oftentimes, so if someone does lose their case in court later on, then they are subject to a 7-year record on their what is it? Is it your credit patience or your rental history? That landlords would be able to screen and find that out. And so then, we've had a tenant that was sharing with us that she had put in application after application in the upwards of about 20 or more and continued to be denied, but was paying for that rental application. And then oftentimes folks are put in housing that is substandard because they have that on their record. And so we just really want to avoid that at all costs. And so an emergency rent fund would go a long way in ensuring that folks don't have an eviction later on. It's good for renters, it's good for homeowners, it's good for everyone. And so we just really want our governor, and we really want the Board of Supervisors and our city council and our mayor to hear that call and put that in place.
Wonderful. And if we don't have any more questions, I think we're going to close our session. I want to say thank you all to our presenters for this really excellent advice and information for our readers and our audience. And thank you to our audience for participating. If you have any more questions that you would like to get answered, of course, if it's a legal question, make sure you reach out to Central California Legal Services at the number that's in the comments. And if you have any other questions about how to navigate this situation, make sure to reach out to Faith in the Valley. And if we're other renter questions, housing questions, if you're a landlord and not sure how to navigate this, send it to us at Fresnoland Lab, and we'll be happy to try to figure out how to connect you to the right information, because we are trying to do our best to make sure that everyone has the information they need to thrive in these very challenging times. Thank you again, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.